To travel, journey, voyage, expedition, tour, pilgrimage, safari, odyssey. To boldly go where no one has gone before. Welcome to our podcast, Travel Unravelled, an ISTM podcast sponsored by the International Society of Travel Medicine and IEMAT, the International Association for Medical Assistance to Travelers. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to Travel Unravelled, your go-to podcast for evidence-based insights on travel medicine. I'm Dr. Aisha Khatib, podcast director for the International Society of Travel Medicine, and this episode is sponsored by IEMAT, the International Association for Medical Assistance to Travelers. Our hosts on the podcast today are ISTM President, Dr. Anne McCarthy. Hi, Anne. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine. How are you?
Good to see you. It's been a while. And Dr. Albie DeFrey, our travel doctor corporate from South Africa, who's having a little bit of technical difficulty at the moment getting on the call. So we're waiting for him, but we're going to keep going because today we are taking you above the clouds into the thin air world of high altitude. So whether you're a traveler planning to hike in the Rockies, explore Machu Picchu, or trek Everest Base Camp, understanding altitude-related risk is going to be critical. From acute mountain sickness to more severe conditions like high-altitude pulmonary or cerebral edema, we'll break down what you need to know about prevention, early recognition, and effective treatment. Now, part of the reason we're talking about this now is because it's mountaineering season. Thousands of climbers worldwide are lacing up their boots to hike up to legendary peaks like Everest and Kilimanjaro, as well as travel to other high-altitude destinations like Bolivia. But while each mountain and area has its own set of challenges, they all share one common thing: the decreasing oxygen levels at altitude that take a toll on the human body.
What's the matter?
My ear's ringing.
It's probably the altitude.
Some altitude.
Look, I don't mean to be rude, but this is not as easy as it looks, so I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't distract me. Sorry. Thank you.
I can't believe people actually do this for fun.
Hold on. We're stopping. Meredith isn't used to the altitude. Just chill, okay?
For example, nearly 50,000 people attempt to climb Mount Kilimanjaro every year, but only about 60% make it to the top. And without proper acclimatization, the chances of developing altitude illness can increase, which can severely impact the ability to reach the summit, and with health consequences ranging from mild headaches and lightheadedness to more severe symptoms like disorientation, confusion, and potentially even risk of death. Now, we've invited several altitude experts from around the world to help us breathe a little easier at the top. And so I'm going to get Anne to help introduce our expert speakers.
So first we have Dr. Stephen Roy, who's with us from Alberta. He's an intensive care physician and consultant in high altitude and wilderness medicine, program director for the Diploma of Wilderness and Expedition Medicine, and co-program director of the resident physician elective in wilderness medicine. He has high altitude experience at many peaks in the Himalayas, the Alps, the Rockies, and the Andes. So then from South Africa, Cape Town, South Africa, we have Dr. Ross Hofmeyer, who is a cardiothoracic anesthesiologist at the University of Cape Town and co-founder and medical director of Wild Medics. He has a special interest in extreme physiology, and he's led expeditions in environments ranging from Antarctica to the tropics, including running mountain medicine training on many of Africa's highest peaks, such as Kilimanjaro and Mount Kenya. And I can, until he gets back, introduce Dr. Suman Acharya, who is with us from Nepal. He's a consultant physician at Lumbini Provincial Hospital, located in the southern border of Nepal. He did his diploma in mountain medicine in 2017 and frequently goes to the Himalayas as an expedition doctor, trains and educates mountain guides and climbers about altitude illness. He's currently serving as the secretary of the Mountain Medicine Society of Nepal and is a board member of the Himalayan Rescue Association. So welcome, gentlemen. It's really great to have you here. I'll hand it over to you, Aisha.
So Stephen, Ross, welcome to the podcast. And so you guys know each other, right?
Stephen looks like he's frozen on my side, but he wasn't so frozen when I first met him. It was actually here in Cape Town. Our Mountain Club of South Africa, on its 150th birthday, hosted a meeting of the International Society for Mountain Medicine, and Steve was one of the delegates. I got to know him there, and have subsequently been lucky to meet up at wilderness medicine and mountain medicine meetings around the world. So great to see you again, Steve, from the other side of the planet.
So Simon and Stephen, so you guys know each other as well, right? So tell us a little bit of how you guys met.
I know Suman through the International Society of Mountain Medicine. I've sat on the board of the ISMM for a little bit over 10 years now, and I think I met Suman for the first time at an ISMM meeting, but I can't remember if it was in Bolzano or if it was I think it was in Kathmandu.
Yes, it was in Kathmandu, Steve.
And recently, a couple weeks ago, I was with Suman again in Kathmandu, and we were teaching some Sherpa and police and docs who do rescue in the Himalayas, and that was a really awesome visit to be able to share with Suman.
Now you guys must have some amazing stories from some of your mountain rescues. Do you guys have anything specifically that you might want to share today? Or do you have anything that's very memorable?
I'm trying to think of a story that's suitable for children.
Yeah, exactly.
Dark twist.
Suman has some stories, I think, of
Yes,
on Everest.
I'll tell one story. We'll come back to this again, but there is a lake called Gosaikunda Lake at the altitude of 4,380 meters near Kathmandu. So I was there as a medical doctor in 2017, I think, and we run a temporary health camp for the pilgrims who climb there. And the pilgrims, they climb there to take a holy bath in the lake. And in morning, we received a call from the lodge owner. Actually, it's not a lodge; it's just a temporary shelter. And we were being called, and we were told that a young guy was found unconscious early in the morning at around 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. And then we went to check. There was no one attending the patient because his friend were there in the lake taking the holy bath early in the morning, and he was there all alone. And we checked, he was unconscious, and we immediately thought it was high altitude cerebral edema haze, and then we treated him. After some time, his friends came back and they told us that they traveled yesterday. They trekked yesterday from 2,000 meters to 4,380 meters in a single day. That's what the pilgrims do. And then they had a little headache last night when they went to sleep. And then the rest of them, they woke up and they went to the lake to take a bath. And then he didn't wake up. And nobody bothered waking him up because everyone was in a rush to go and take the bath. So we gave him oxygen, we gave him dex, and then we descended him after about 500 meters, descending him to 500 meters, and then he regained consciousness. These are group of peoples without insurance, so there was no medical evacuations. We used army, and then they put the patient in the back, used stretchers, and then they descended him down. Somehow his life was saved, and that's a story.
Wow. That's incredible.
It's scary how non-dramatic severe illness can be, right? He's just sort of sleeping and not waking up. There's nothing really to put alarm bells to his buddies to say, hey, this guy's in trouble. It's very scary how he could have just slipped away completely.
And I think that's a good place to start with the basics to talk about what are the actual definitions of altitude illness. And I know Suman mentioned a couple things like the high altitude cerebral edema, but maybe we can get one of the experts to give us a broad definition of what we're talking about today.
So maybe we can start with Stephen. Stephen, you gave a recent talk at the Asia Pacific Travel Health Society meeting in Nepal last fall, which was excellent. So maybe you can give us some ideas with respect to altitude illness and early warning signs, what it really looks like in practice.
Sure. Thanks, Anne. So there are many altitude illnesses, but the ones that people usually focus on are the single most common altitude illness, acute mountain sickness, and the two life-threatening forms of altitude illness, high altitude cerebral edema and high altitude pulmonary edema. So these three illnesses all occur as a result of going up the mountain or in the hot air balloon, or any time that you change altitude quickly without giving your body time to adapt. Just to briefly summarize them, acute mountain sickness kind of looks and feels like a hangover, and it's not dangerous. It doesn't we don't have to worry too much that this is itself life-threatening. But the thing that I hope people will remember is that AMS is the body's way of telling you that you're not acclimatized to the altitude that you're visiting. And so it's time to stop and wait and let your body catch up to how far you've climbed. As it usually occurs before the other two altitude illnesses that are life-threatening. So it's kind of a warning sign in itself. And the two severe altitude illnesses that we really want to avoid are high altitude pulmonary edema and high altitude cerebral edema. So high altitude cerebral edema, unlike AMS, which kind of looks and feels like a hangover with its headache and GI upset malaise, high altitude cerebral edema looks like someone who is drunk or who is comatose, who's clearly has neurological abnormalities or alterations. So someone with a depressed level of consciousness, or who is unable to walk in a straight line, having trouble balancing, these things are potential signs that the brain is starting to swell as a result of the high altitude stress. And this is obviously quite life-threatening, and the way that we resolve that is to descend and to use some medications to help us descend, like Suman mentioned, dexamethasone, oxygen, and sometimes a portable hyperbaric chamber.
And to John's
And then,
Stephen, so the cerebral edema and the pulmonary edema just means fluid, right, on the brain and fluid on the lung.
yeah.
For those
Thank you. Yeah. So
who may not understand what that means.
edema means water, means basically that the organ is swollen, and so sometimes we say, high altitude pulmonary edema is water on the lungs as a result of going to high altitude. So cerebral edema means water on the brain, swollen brain, and these two illnesses are life-threatening. Both of them result from rapid descent to high altitude in someone who is not acclimatized, who hasn't given their body enough time to adapt to that altitude. And basically with both of them, the treatment and the life-saving intervention is descent, is going down, and you don't have to go down very far to get a lot better, as Suman's story illustrates with that 500 meters of descent. We would usually try to do a kilometer if possible, but often people improve really quickly.
Hi, Albie.
Hi, Aisha. Hi, team. I think I'm having a touch of AMS. It's sort of called cyber AMS or something.
Well, we can hear you and see you perfectly right now, so that's good.
Yeah, I descended 2 stories. That did the trick.
Descent, it makes all the difference.
All the difference. I just now that I'm allowed to say something, Steve, you were saying AMS. It looks like a hangover. So I think when we planned this, I related the story of how we tough South Africans flew into Peru, spent a few days at sea level, then flew up to Cusco, then went off to a birthday party. And when everybody felt hangovery and a little bit nauseous and a bit this and a bit that the next day, we blamed the crevice. You shouldn't eat raw fish in a country in South America. And it was days later when we were clearing Dead Woman's Pass on the Inca Trail that it dawned on the travel doctors in the group that what looked like a hangover or maybe slightly off fish was in fact AMS. We were caught out. And I think when we were planning this, and when I roped Ross in as well, I thought I'll dress up today to look like a mountaineer, you know, something like Indiana Jones. But in fact, people get into trouble with this, not just by climbing the Himalayas or running up Kilimanjaro, but people get into trouble by flying into typical tourist destinations or even business destinations. You go to La Paz as a business traveler, you know, you're not going to think about this unless somebody tells you about it and makes you aware of the symptoms and the possible consequences if you don't take quick care of it. So climbing and AMS and Hape and Haze is not just for the tough and the rough and ready. It's for ordinary, very often packaged tourists that end up in places like Cusco or La Paz or a couple of other high altitude destinations that you can easily fly into. You don't have to walk your butt off.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And in some ways, people who fly in might be, you know, arguably higher risk because people who are going on a mountain trek have some general idea. I hope that, you know, there might be some illness related to altitude illness or something called acclimatization. They have some clue, but a business person going to a meeting in a city may or may not be at all aware that the risk of what they're doing. And similarly, they may not, you know, seeing themselves go to an urban setting, they may not reach out to or go to visit a travel medicine doctor, right? Thinking, oh, I'm just going to be in the city, I'm just going to be in the hotel, I'm not at risk of I don't need malaria prophylaxis, I don't need these things because I'm just going to be in these urban settings, and then miss entirely this risk of altitude illness.
I was recently in Cusco with a bunch of travel agent people, actually, and 8 out of 10 of them had quite severe symptoms. It was interesting. Somebody had a migraine for the whole 5 days we were there. And as soon as we touched down in Lima, you know, their headache went away. People started feeling normal. It was very impressive. And a lot of that was blamed on, like you say, the ceviche or whatever, right? Their GI complaints and their headaches and stuff. They wouldn't believe that it was due to altitude at all because they were in a big, you know, in a bigger center in Cusco. But ironically, that's more risk than Machu Picchu, right? And people think about the mountains in Machu Picchu, right?
Yeah, and we went all prepared. We had everybody on Diamox, acetazolamide, in our pockets, ready for when we start walking the Inca Trail because Dead Woman's Pass. But we didn't even dream about taking it for Cusco. Well, we were sort of aware, but didn't think about it when it happened. And we had the same experience. 1 person didn't come out of his room the next day. 2 of us were fine, and the rest of the group all had lesser or more symptoms. But in the shower just now, I was thinking, we're talking about AMS and the really serious stuff from climbing. But I think something that dawned on me was how people misreckon just mountains. And I think, Stephen, when we were planning this, you sort of touched on that, all the other things around climbing. And it reminded me that about 20 years ago, a friend turned 40. And this is from Ross's town. So during the week when I spoke to him, he said, I'm turning 40. Don't you want to walk up Table Mountain with me on Saturday morning? Of course, yeah, walking up Table Mountain. I mean, why not? Well, about 60% up, I thought I was going to die from atrial fibrillation or something. And the bottle of champagne in my backpack became extremely heavy. But we made it up. But what really struck me once I recovered from my atrial fibrillation was the tourist buses that were dropping tourists at the bottom of the mountain, and the Italians that were passing me in Gucci shoes and Panama hats and tropical suits, completely unprepared for what the tour operators were actually encouraging them to do, is just quickly walk up to the top of Table Mountain. Now, you're not going to get AMS from walking up Table Mountain, but you can get a freaking heart attack or Ross knows about, too many people that get lost and fall down crevices, etc. So we're talking about AMS, but there are lots of other things that one needs to be aware of if you blunder into the mountains.
So, Albie, I thought this would be a good opportunity to introduce your countryman, Ross, who's sitting at the base of Table Mountain right now, actually.
Yeah, but that's a fake picture behind him. I just spent the last 6 days there. You never see that much of the mountain. It's all grey, and very often you can't even see through the window with all the raindrops on it. So don't believe that touristy picture behind him. Ross, you're welcome. And I dragged you in because I just felt that we can't leave Africa out. Stephen put his foot in when he said, one of the most dangerous climbs in the world is Kilimanjaro for a variety of reasons. And I said, I think I know an expert. So welcome. We've got two experts from the other sides of the world, but I felt that it was necessary to bring somebody in that actually done the hard yards going up Kili. And you also mentioned a couple of other mountains in Africa that I've never even heard of. So maybe you want to mention them as well.
Oh, thanks very much, Albie, and it's great to be here amongst so many learned people and hearing lots of really great stories. You're quite right. If I look through the window over there, I should be able to see Devil's Peak and Table Mountain less than a kilometer away, and I can't because it's currently wreathed in thick cloud and very heavy rainfall. And actually, your segue really speaks to two of the things which bring a lot of danger to mountains, and Table Mountain and Kilimanjaro both being somewhat flat on top have parallels in that we do a huge number of mountain rescues on Table Mountain, which is only about 1,000 meters high, just over 3,000 feet. Because it's right in the middle of a city, it's surrounded by suburban areas on almost all sides, and it looks like a walk in the park, but it is, as you observed, really a challenging wilderness environment. And Kilimanjaro, as a parallel, is a freestanding mountain. It's the highest freestanding mountain in the world, surrounded by lowlands. So whichever way you approach it, you're approaching from quite low altitudes. But it is considered amongst the seven summits as being a walk in the park. It's certainly the easiest big trekking peak in the world. And so people assail it from all sides with very low levels of experience and very, very little time for acclimatization. And I think that's really speaks to what we've got to talk about here, which is how do we prepare people for going to these high altitude areas. And also, I suppose we must give the uninitiated listener an idea of what we actually mean when we talk about high altitude, and what is high and when are people putting themselves at risk.
I think that's an important aspect there, Ross. And we've heard about a few different locations now. We've heard of Peru. We've heard about Kilimanjaro. Stephen sitting in the Rockies there in Alberta. So where in the world is high altitude risk? And I think it's important to note, at what level we talk about altitude. Because you talk about Table Mountain being 1,000 meters. Cusco is about 3,399 meters, or 11,000 feet for the Americans. And the Kilimanjaro, Tanzania, sits about 5,895 meters. And Mount Everest, of course, is the highest at 8,848 meters. But we know there's a lot of examples of destinations where travelers are going to where they may not be anticipating high altitude, or they may not even be trekking, right? So for example, there's airports at high altitude where you can fly directly into high altitude cities, and this in itself can give increased risk for altitude sickness. So places like La Paz, Bolivia, for example, is at 3,650 meters. We have Lhasa, Tibet, which is at 3,570 meters. So these are examples that altitude illness can even be a concern in cities and travel hubs, and not just in remote trekking destinations. So I'll pass it back to some of the experts to give us an idea of when they should be expecting altitude illness, and go from there.
Traditionally, 2,500 meters has been used as the threshold for high altitude illness. But in rare cases, mild illness occurs in person who have ascended above 2,000 meters. So we should expect high altitude illness when we ascend to more than 2,500 meters, but sometimes it can occur at altitude above 2,000 meters. As we go higher and higher, the risk of altitude illness or we say the incidence of high altitude illness increases. So the illness incidence of high altitude illness is higher when we are in Everest base camp compared to when we are in Namche Bazaar. The Everest base camp is at 5,300 meters, whereas the Namche Bazaar, which is a gateway to Everest, it's in 3,500 meters. So so we should expect high altitude illness from 2,500 meters onward, but it can we can see it as low as 2,000 meters.
A couple of years ago, an airline medical director told me that they get complaints from their cabin crew that they don't sleep well in Johannesburg because it's so high, and it sits at 1,700 meters. And I'm really just putting this in to brag that Joburg is 700 meters higher than Table Mountain. There's no competition between Cape Town and Joburg. It's just something to mention. But Ross, you mentioned something very briefly that Stephen alluded to when we spoke earlier, and that is, so you were saying Kilimanjaro is an easy climb. It's one of the most, well, you didn't say it's an easy climb. You said it's one of the most accessible high climbs in the world. But you also alluded to, or Stephen alluded to, short time span. And that, and I haven't climbed it, but I'm aware of things that it's called the Coca-Cola route, and it just makes it sound easy. And you know, you have a cola on the side while you quickly walk up the mountain. But there's actually, Kilimanjaro is quite dangerous, isn't it?
I mean, if we look at the medical literature, in fact, we can see that the risk of acute mountain sickness and more severe illness is very, very high on Kilimanjaro. And this echoes our experience of having people trekking and climbing on the mountain. Looking at a conglomerate of different studies, particularly with the shorter duration climbs where people are climbing a lot faster, the risk of the acute mountain sickness that Stephen was speaking about in some studies is as high as 94-95% of participants. There was also a good paper where they looked at successful summiters coming off the summit of Kili. So on Kili you often sleep your last night before the summit at around 4,800 meters, so already quite high. And then you climb to the summit, often for sunrise, and then immediately descend again the same day. And they looked at people coming off the summit, and they found that almost 1 in 5 had clinically diagnosable high-altitude cerebral edema. And that's an absolutely terrifying statistic because, as Stephen alluded, HACE is a life-threatening illness. If we don't treat it with descent and medications and oxygen, it will result in someone's worsening and ultimately death. And if you said to a group, well, we're going to go and do this fun travel activity, there is a 1 in 5 chance that you're going to get a life-threatening illness, I don't think you'd be selling a lot of travel and tours. And yet this is still a very, very common practice of people taking on these challenges of climbing these mountains without necessarily being well advised of the risks and how to mitigate those risks.
Why do people go up and down Kili so quickly?
The thing that I want to add to what Ross has highlighted is the thing that's most alarming about that story or that anecdote is that this is an entirely preventable disease, right? All you have to do is go slower to the summit. The reason why there's such a high incidence of altitude illness and severe altitude illness on Kilimanjaro is because there's a time pressure caused in part by the way that the summit permits are issued to go very fast in only a few days from sea level to the summit. And if people take their time and listen to their bodies, this wouldn't happen at all.
So Stephen, is very interesting. I never really worry about my older retired travelers because they have time and they're usually sensible and they're going to take the longest they can to get to the summit. But I worry about the type A personality, people who have, a very short a period of time and they want to do everything in Tanzania, including go up Kili in 2 weeks, plus safaris and everything else. Those are the people I worry about because they don't take the time to acclimatize and really have potential to get in trouble.
Absolutely. And I would add that they're raising funds for charity. And so they have this emotional commitment not letting down the people that they raised money for by not making it to the summit, and so they push themselves far past what they might normally if they weren't feeling obligated or committed to a specific cause to make it to the summit.
Okay, Stephen, I think that's a very good point about this being preventable. Maybe we can have a little discussion about what sort of things we can do to prevent acute mountain illness. I'm
curious, Ross, I see a lot of, when I send people out, see people who are going to go climbing, I usually ask where they're going, and if they're going to Kilimanjaro, I almost always send them on acetazolamide prophylaxis. But I'm curious what your perspective in Africa.
For those listening in who don't know what this is, what is acetazolamide? How does it work? And when should a traveler be taking it?
Acetazolamide is a diuretic drug which inhibits an enzyme in the kidneys which is responsible for reabsorbing bicarbonate into the blood. Now, when we travel to high altitude, one of the body's mechanisms for acclimatization is actually to hyperventilate, which blows off some of our carbon dioxide, allowing more space for oxygen in our blood. But that has the side effect of making the blood a little bit less acidic, a little bit more basic, and so the kidneys try and eliminate the bicarbonate in order to bring the blood's pH back into balance. And so taking a drug which helps us to eliminate bicarbonate is a way of speeding up the process of acclimatization. It can't replace that process. We still need time for that to occur, but it helps the body along. And so that's really the role of Diamox or acetazolamide. So when it comes to planning or assessing a risk profile for people climbing, we know that giving the body time to acclimatize is the most important step that we can take. And so a graded ascent over a number of days, is particularly days of sleeping at gradually increasing altitudes, is the way that the people can adjust and over time actually acclimatize and have the fun that they were planning. Now, the international guidelines and consensus has been built over experience over time, and we know that an increase in your sleeping altitude of about 500 meters or 1,500 feet per day is a safe acclimatization speed, especially if you allow an extra rest day here and there about every vertical kilometer that you are climbing. And you need to start doing this once you ascend past around 3,000 or 3,500 meters. So if we take Kilimanjaro as an example and recognize that many of the trekking routes, when you reach the trailhead, depending which side of the mountain you're approaching from, many of those trailheads are between about 2,500 and 3,000 meters. And the summit is just shy of 6,000 meters. It's pretty easy math to work out that you're going to need about 6 days to climb that if you are going to maintain that 500 meters a day altitude gain. Of course, on your summit day, you can bounce up the top and come down fairly quickly. You don't have to stay at 6,000 meters, but also we need to build in a little bit of extra time for those rest days to allow the body more time to acclimatize. So a 6-day ascent, maybe taking a day or two to come down, would be the verge of what is a safe climbing trip on Kili. And as Steve and Albie have alluded to, obviously there's a financial imperative that many people are trying to pack as much into a holiday as they can, and time on the mountain costs money. You're in a national park, you've got guides, you've got porters, you've got a lot of infrastructure. Everything on the mountain has to be carried up the mountain, and so all of that does cost money. And so doing a quicker trip is ultimately going to be a cheaper trip. And historically, there were Kili climbing trips which were planned for normal tourists of as short as a 4-day round trip from bottom to top and back again. And clearly that's way too fast. If we think about it carefully and we plan carefully, a minimum of 7 days or 1 week trip on the mountain would be the threshold for safety. And in fact, it's interesting to note that the Wilderness Medical Society's previous editions of their altitude guidelines used a less than 7-day trek on Kilimanjaro as their definition or their prime example of a high-risk acclimatization profile. And when people are taking these higher risk profiles, that's when we advise them that they should consider using some kind of medical prophylaxis, such as the Diamox. If you can afford, as Anne was saying, to spend more time on the mountain, to spend more time doing a gradual ascent, or even doing some acclimatization in a different area or on a different mountain, then you're going to have a much greater success, a much more pleasant time, and a much reduced risk of actually getting sick.
Ross has given a really well-articulated, really fantastic answer. I want to add just a point about acetazolamide, that sometimes when people take acetazolamide, they think that they can't get altitude illness. And it's important for them to realize that it lowers the risk of altitude illness, but it doesn't eliminate the risk. And some work that we've been doing that has not yet been published, we estimated about a 20% decrease at a given altitude of the incidence of acute mountain sickness. So it lowers the likelihood of it, but it doesn't eliminate it. And if you go really fast, even on acetazolamide, you can get very, very sick and in all likelihood life-threatening altitude illness.
I'd like to add a point on it. That's a fantastic point from Steve. And when to take acetazolamide, I would advise, if someone is ascending, it should be started 12 hours prior to reaching 2,500 meters, and then continued for about 2 days at a stable altitude, or if you can stop if you are descending down. So regarding Isa was picking up about the side effect. Acetazolamide is quite a safe drug, but it can cause numbness, especially on the tips of your fingers and around the mouth. So sometimes we see a client complaining about those paresthesia if we don't explain to them beforehand. So it's sometimes it also it has been said that Diamox also causes diuresis, but it's a very weak diuretics. So but again, advising the travelers to drink more is always a good idea when they are taking acetazolamide.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we often think about, like you say, you start the night before and you take it for 2 days after you reach the summit, but people have to get to the summit. So we have to make sure, if you're doing pre-travel advice and prescriptions for people, that they have enough to get them to the higher altitude.
The same as with malaria prophylaxis. We often advise people to take a trial run back at home. So experience the tingling in your fingers. So you say, oh, okay, that's tingling in my fingers. That's not the end of the world. I experienced that when we did the Inca Trail, and it was like, oh, my backpack is sitting a little bit stiff and heavy. And then, oh, no, that's not the backpack. That's the tingling from the acetazolamide. But that's fine. You can live with that. It's much better than getting mountain sickness. So I think awareness, and it's the same thing with malaria prophylaxis, which, if people try it out beforehand, then they know whether they're going to be a little bit nauseous, a little bit of this, and then your adherence to it is much better.
I was going to just chip in a quick point to tie into Steve's mention of the 20% reduction in risk. And I've got a teaching slide that I love to use where we map out different Kilimanjaro ascent profiles as an example. And I mentioned that about 95% risk of AMS with a 4-day ascent. If you stretch that ascent out to 8 or 9 days, that risk drops to about a 5 to 15% incidence. So if you can imagine that you are just, by taking a bit longer, reducing your risk to the point where using a drug to help your acclimatization, like acetazolamide, could actually bring that risk close to, obviously never reaching, but close to zero.
What about fitness? Is it worthwhile joining a gym before you go and climb? I've even seen guys in the gym with a funny mask. It looks like the guy's trying to be Tom Cruise or something. Does that help to avoid altitude illness?
The fitness is important if you're going to go and do exercise for 12 hours a day, every day for a week or multiple weeks. it's important to be fit. Fitness itself does not protect people against altitude illness, and this is a common misconception. I see social media posts of famous climbers who say, oh, we didn't expect to get altitude illness because we thought we were fit. This is definitely completely unrelated. If anything, there may be a slight increase in altitude illness among very fit people, mostly because they move faster up the mountain and they're used to pushing through pain and discomfort. And so they have a tendency, I think, to push their limits even when they have headache or shortness of breath. And I think that may get some folks into trouble. But fitness itself doesn't interact with altitude illness. As Ross said, one of the main ways that we acclimatize to altitude is work that our kidney does and eventually work that our bone marrow does, but it's not really work that our heart and lungs do per se.
I do have a question about the, staying hydrated with something like maybe if there is a bit of a mild diuresis, and maybe some of the misconceptions around things like coca tea, and whether that can prevent altitude. I know they're often offered when you climb up to Machu Picchu or when you're going into Cusco. I know even when you take the acetazolamide, it can change the taste of those carbonated beverages and make them more metallic. So could you speak a little bit to that, and also maybe to other preventative strategies, and whether taking something like ibuprofen, I know we use in the travel medicine world as a preventative. So how efficacious is that?
There has been some debate about ibuprofen as prophylaxis. There's lots of different things we can take for prophylaxis. The best studied one, and clearly, the choice, is acetazolamide. In my opinion, ibuprofen probably, I don't believe that ibuprofen itself prevents mountain sickness per se. I think it prevents the diagnostic criteria for altitude illness, such as headache. So in studies that have studied ibuprofen at high altitude, we use something called the Lake Louise scale in research to diagnose acute mountain sickness. And one of the things that is required for the diagnosis of acute mountain sickness in research, not necessarily clinically, is a headache. So if you take analgesic and you don't have a headache, but you still have all the physiology happening that is leading your body to be stressed from the altitude, but you don't have a headache because you've taken analgesia, I'm not convinced that means that you don't have acute mountain sickness necessarily, or the risk, more importantly, of more life-threatening forms of altitude illness. So until we have much better studies on ibuprofen, I think ibuprofen is totally appropriate to take for someone who is having headache and headache is bothering them. But I personally don't recommend it as a prophylaxis. I recommend that people listen to their body, and when they have headache and they feel lousy and they don't really feel like eating, that's their body's way of telling them that it's time for a rest day. And some ibuprofen, maybe. And you asked about a couple other remedies. I'll punt those over to Suman and Ross.
So there are some unproven remedies that are widely used in the Himalayas as well. Those are very common, especially with the Nepali trekkers rather than with the foreign trekkers. But the lodges along the trail will lure the trekkers to take them. Those are garlic, ginger, black peppers, something like that. But and they have been found that they are unproven. There are no scientific evidence to support their use in preventing altitude illness. But one thing is, if you take the garlic soup, it might not help you with altitude sickness, but it might help you with hydration. So when we teach the lodge owners that it's better to give the trekkers or the pilgrimage who goes to high altitude to take the garlic soup rather than taking the garlic, which is not helpful at all. So another thing about preventive non-pharmacological prevention, one thing I would like to mention other than gradual ascent is pre-acclimatization. This thing is being widely discussed and new upcoming things in the market. The pre-acclimatization is like intermittent exposure to either a normobaric, that is normal pressure hypoxia, that is low oxygen, or hypobaric hypoxia, that is low pressure, low oxygen, either through a chamber or through a mask. So the evidence, there are evidence showing there is some benefit in preventing altitude sickness when you go to real altitude after exposure to this method. One thing we know for certain is like short exposures in normobaric hypoxia are not much helpful, but long exposure in the hypobaric hypoxia chambers are likely to be beneficial. So there are several studies that shows benefit in them, and we are seeing lots of climbers in Himalayas who directly flow from New York to Kathmandu to Everest Base Camp and go to summit. We are seeing these climbers, a few climbers these days who are preparing, who are acclimatizing themselves back in New York or in London or wherever their home is.
Yeah, I think that is a really, really important point because, again, there's been a lot of media attention recently about this team which has climbed Everest exceptionally rapidly. They did from London to the summit of Everest and back to London in less than 7 days, which you've heard me saying is a dangerous ascent on Kilimanjaro, let alone Everest itself. And a lot of the attention around that team's success has been the very exotic use of pre-breathing xenon, which is a noble gas which actually is used in anesthesia. And we know physiologically actually being exposed to xenon gas can trigger some of the body's mechanisms similar to being exposed to high altitude. So that's a fascinating area for future research. But what people are missing out on in this exciting story about rapid climbs and breathing exotic gases is that was a really dedicated, quite fit team, most of them former Special Forces soldiers who spent at least 6 to 8 weeks prior to the expedition doing acclimatization in normobaric hypoxic tents. So they were doing long-term exposures to a lower oxygen environment in order to pre-acclimatize. And that is a potentially quite useful strategy rather than some of these more off-the-wall ideas and some of the folk remedies. And just to echo something that Suman also mentioned, to do with the garlic soup and Aisha's coca tea and the whole issue around hydration. And that maintaining good hydration when you're doing outdoor activities in the mountains is always important. We do lose a lot more fluid when we're exercising hard. There's a lot more insensible loss through the rapid breathing that we're exposed to at high altitudes. The high altitude environment tends to be less humid, and so you're losing even more moisture to the environment than you would think. You may not realize how much you're sweating. And in fact, headache at altitude is you have to eliminate all of the other potential causes before you can call it a high altitude headache, and one of those causes is dehydration. So we do tend to really encourage people to hydrate well when they are doing these high altitude treks and climbs, and particularly if they are making use of acetazolamide, they need to be passing plenty of urine for their kidneys to be functioning well for the drug to help them acclimatize. So good hydration while avoiding hyper or overhydration is an important mechanism for helping the body acclimatize, but it does need the time.
Acclimatization that you guys are talking about sounds like something for the privileged few. If you're gonna spend a lot of money before your trip, right, and a lot of time to get pre-acclimatized to be able to do that trip in a short period of time. And I would think most people that are going, whether it's to the Himalayas or it's to Kili or it's to South America to peaks, probably aren't going to be doing stuff like that. So you're right. We always have to be careful about what makes the news and what sounds like it's safe, because it may put more people at risk.
That's a great point. Ross earlier mentioned that the kidney is peeing out bicarbonate to help keep the pH of the blood stable, to make it a little bit more acidic. And one of the reasons why the hydration is important is because when people are dehydrated, what happens to their pH? They get what's called a contraction alkalosis. So they get a more basic blood pH as a result of being dehydrated. And the whole point is to get our pH higher of acclimatization of acetazolamide. Then being dehydrated is counterproductive to acclimatization. So in addition to, not having a headache, in addition to being able to allow the diuresis that needs to happen, it's also counterproductive to be dehydrated. Understanding we also don't want to overhydrate someone or get them into trouble with massive amounts of water they're taking in. That won't make the situation better either. So we need to maintain hydration as Ross mentioned.
So I see every time somebody mentions dehydration, the ladies are taking a sip of coffee. Subliminal suggestion. So there are two other things. So I think if at my age, if you think about peeing, you think about not sleeping, and I think one of the symptoms of mountain sickness is also disturbed sleep patterns. So what about the prophylactic use of hypnotics to keep you down? And then there's the other drug that keeps you up, which is mentioned now and then and deserves a mention, which is sildenafil. I see you smiling, Stephen, so you look like you've got experience.
Not with sildenafil. No, I'm laughing because yes, there are drugs we can use to help us sleep, but the drug that I would suggest is most effective in helping sleep is actually acetazolamide. So sedating someone who is having trouble sleeping at altitude is in my opinion not the best option for a variety of reasons. But I think the most important is that why are people having trouble sleeping at altitude? The reason they're having trouble sleeping at altitude, for one of the major reasons, is that they're having sleep apnea. So they're having, instead of obstructive sleep apnea, or in addition to obstructive sleep apnea, I should say, as some climbers still have obstructive sleep apnea. In addition to that, at high altitude, when we're sleeping and our drive to breathe is a little bit lower, we end up in this oscillation where we breathe too slow and then we breathe too fast. And that causes these long periods of not breathing that they're troublesome for both you and your tent partner, who all of a sudden you stop breathing for 30 seconds and then gasp for air and start taking these big breaths as you come out of the apnea. And so that wakes up both people, right? So in addition to many trekkers, I'll say, are not professional mountaineers, right? They're not people who are used to sleeping in a tent all the time. And so they sleep poorly because they're not in their usual bed. They're in a much less comfortable sleeping position. And then they have these sleep apneas on top of any pre-existing sleep apnea they have. So sleep is going to be lousy at high altitude. That's partly a result of the apnea, and acetazolamide almost eliminates the apneas, the sleep apneas in patients who don't have pre-existing apnea. So because we have a medication that can help the underlying cause, in medicine we try to treat the underlying cause. If we're going to give medication to help someone sleep, I would suggest acetazolamide might be the better drug than sedation.
I'm going off to the pharmacy immediately after this podcast because maybe it'll help me at 1,700 meters to sleep.
So to add on Steve's point, having difficulty sleep at high altitude without others, if there are no other symptoms, it's normal. And if there are and when you have AMS, you have a higher chance that your sleep is going to be disturbed more because of altitude sickness, because one of the symptoms of AMS is disturbed sleep. But if you only have apnea and no other symptoms at all, I think you don't have to be worried. But you can take, as Steve just mentioned, you can take acetazolamide. That will help with your sleep. And to catch one point earlier about dehydrations, and I would like to add one thing. When we are talking about high altitude, all about high altitude illness, we also should be careful about other non-high altitude illness, such as traveler's diarrhea, because it might add on to the dehydration that is common at high altitude because of exertion. So traveler's diarrhea is quite common in the South Asia and in other part of the world. When you are traveling, I would advise to be very careful about hand hygiene, to take properly treated waters and only cooked foods. So there is a very popular dictum in the travel medicine: either you cook it, either you boil it, either you peel it, or forget it. So when you take food, it should be very well cooked, or when you take water, it should be well treated. And if you have a diarrhea, then you would land up in a problem. It might ruin up your trip. So when we are discussing altitude illness, I wanted to add some non-altitude illness, because that also ruins our trip.
Thanks, Suman. But you also touched on another important one just now when you mentioned the garlic soup. So does garlic soup also help you not to get a respiratory tract infection? But it sort of brings us to the other measures to ensure a safe trip. So it's probably not a bad idea to make sure that you're topped up with your standard travel vaccines. I'm sure on a trip like that, there are many scratches with the risk of tetanus, even at high altitude. And then, of course, there's all the respiratory illnesses. People shack up together in hostels and in small tents. So your vaccine preventable diseases don't go away when you go up a mountain. They're important. And then the other one that sort of ties in with Ross's neck of the woods is the whole concept of climbing and safari, and the risk at low altitude, and in East Africa in particular, of malaria. And that can be a little bit of a dilemma as to people are concerned about taking malaria prophylaxis because they worried about the side effects on the mountain. So what do the experts suggest in terms of getting around that one?
I can definitely speak to that, Albie, and my standard advice to people is do the climbing trip before the safari, so that you're not on your potentially sedative and other side effect generating malaria prophylaxis when you are climbing Mount Kenya or Kilimanjaro. One of the benefits, of course, of being high is that once you're higher up on the mountain, the air is too thin to support the mosquitoes. It's really more that it's just too cold for mosquitoes to survive, and so you're fairly mosquito free. But it is a very genuine risk traveling into these areas with big mountains, and Kili, the Ruvenzoris, and Mount Kenya being the 5,000 meter plus examples. That the first day or two of travel into the country, people do need to be very, very conscious about non-pharmacological malaria prevention, because when you're flying into Kilimanjaro International or Moshi or Arusha or Nairobi, all of those areas do carry the risk of mosquitoes. But we generally recommend climb first and then relax and drink the beers on safari. I think it's probably useful, just while we're talking about other illnesses and other medications, to just think about what other potential altitude prophylaxis or treatment medications it might be worth carrying or recommending that people have. And we've spoken quite a lot about acute mountain sickness, and the sequelae of AMS really is that it's often considered or seen as the prodrome that leads towards the development of high altitude cerebral edema. And then the high altitude pulmonary edema, the water on the lungs that Stephen was mentioning earlier, is a similar disease process which can occur independently. We've said that the primary prophylaxis for acute mountain sickness and for haze as well is acetazolamide. We do have other options. It is possible to use steroids, for instance, in people who've got drug allergies and can't take acetazolamide. But you were looking for people with experience of a certain drug, a little blue pill, I believe, and that is the one that generates a fun conversation every time I have to restock my high altitude bag and I walk into the pharmacy looking for Viagra before my climbing trip. And the conversation usually follows a certain pattern with me making a joke about sleeping bags and narrow ledges. But really the sildenafil is something that we can use as a treatment or a preventative agent for high altitude pulmonary edema. And we tend to only use HAPE prophylaxis in individuals who've had an episode of HAPE before or who have a very, very high susceptibility. So it's not a standard prophylactic, and in fact it's not generally considered to be the first line treatment drug either. So it may be something that you would carry as an expedition doctor or a trip doctor, but it's not the kind of thing we frequently recommend that people add to their climbing kit.
So what other measures would you recommend to add to a first aid climbing kit? If you're speaking to a traveler about to head off into the wilderness, what else would you want them to have in their kit?
Well, I'm worried, Ashi, you're going to ask three supposed experts here and get 5 opinions straight off the bat. But maybe I can spout off a couple and let Suman and Steve chip in with what I've forgotten or their potential favorites. Obviously, we're looking at managing the most common high-altitude illnesses and high-altitude headache, but also other forms of headache, so we can get it out of our differential is there. I always carry paracetamol and ibuprofen. We've spoken about the acetazolamide already. For people who are going to areas with bugs, for people who are having sleeping disorders, for people who may have allergic reactions, I'm always carrying promethazine in my bag. It's a very, very multifunctional drug and very useful for a number of different things. A very common medical problem at high altitudes is sunburn, and so carrying something to manage and treat sunburn, and especially on more delicate parts of the body like lips and other places, is really, really handy to have along. And then I've obviously got my standard medical kit that I'm carrying for any kind of trip, and that's going to have a spread of other antimicrobials and other things in it as well. True to my anesthetic form, I've always got a little bit of local anesthetic and one or two tools up my sleeve to deal with the nicks and the cuts and the minor trauma. But I'm keen to hear what the others like to carry.
Yeah, that's a great summary of important things to carry. Specifically for high altitude travel, I think it's important that people carry the life-saving treatments. At least one person in the group should carry the life-saving drugs that we use to treat high-altitude cerebral edema and high-altitude pulmonary edema. So typically the first line medication to facilitate descent when someone has high-altitude cerebral edema is dexamethasone. So either in an oral formulation or an injectable formulation, if the person carrying it has the skills to give intramuscular or intravenous medication. Then so dexamethasone should be, I think, in every kit. One person on a trip, particularly in very remote places where there might not be oxygen or hyperbaric chambers, would be nifedipine. So like sildenafil, nifedipine is used to treat high-altitude pulmonary edema and is the drug that is the first line drug for high-altitude pulmonary edema, again, to facilitate descent, to make it easier for the person to be able to, who's completely out of breath, to be able to walk on their own power, because carrying someone down the mountain is very difficult. So if we can make the person well enough to move themselves down the mountain, that would be preferable, and the way to do that is with oxygen and nifedipine. And then for acute mountain sickness, just to point out that we also can use acetazolamide. If we have decided not to take it as prophylaxis, we can use acetazolamide to treat bad acute mountain sickness, and that is done with a 250 milligram dose as opposed to the 125 milligram dose that is commonly used for prophylaxis. So it's a slightly higher dose. And so even if someone is not prescribed it as prophylaxis, particularly if they're going on high-risk trips, I encourage them to take it with them if they're not going to take it every day. And then, so those are just to make sure that we include these sort of well-known or critical medications for the high-altitude illnesses. But then we also want to think about the things that are really common in the symptomatic management. So I like to carry, one thing that I really like in my kit, and I actually carry in my wallet, is ondansetron oral dissolving film. And this has gotten me out of a bunch of bad situations where, a diabetic has taken their insulin and then is nauseous and not able to take in the glucose that they need. And the nice thing about the film is it weighs nothing. It's flat. It doesn't. It's not affected in its packaging by the humidity or the heat, and you can fold it and tear it to change the dose from 8 milligrams to 4 milligrams, for instance, if you decide that you need to treat someone whose smaller frame might warrant a smaller dose.
And for those who are listening who might not know what that medication is, it's an anti-nausea medication that's commonly used.
But yeah, so just having medications that to treat common ailments, and for me, safety pins and tape are the indispensable thing that I put in with my medical gloves, first, and then depending on how many kits there'll be on the trip and whether I'm bringing the main kit or just a personal kit, then you build up from there.
That was a great point from Steve. I would agree on all of those points. One of my trips, I ran out of anti-nausea medications. I like the mouth dissolving ondansetron or granisetron that's available in Nepal. It's very good drug, and lots of people with acute mountain sickness, they develop nausea, and these drugs really help. So on one of those trips where I ran out of the anti-nausea medications, after that experience, I started taking more of the anti-nausea drug. Other than that, some life-saving drugs such as adrenaline for the anaphylaxis, and to some simple symptomatic things such as a blister kit is really helpful. It's a simple procedure. Trekkers can go on trekking. So high altitude drugs has been mentioned, pain medications has already been mentioned, and a small trauma kit, and the medications, antimicrobials for traveler's diarrhea, URTI, are some of the medicines that I always carry in my medical kit. It also depends on how big is the number of the trip. And also, beforehand I ask what are the comorbidities that my clients has, because my medical kit depends on their comorbidities. So I usually send the form and ask what are the comorbidities that they have.
And the comorbidities basically are other medical illnesses that somebody may be presenting. Yeah.
I think one of the important things that each of you mentioned is these are things to sort of temporize as you go down. It's really the descent that saves the lives, right? Maybe someone can comment on the use of bringing bags up or getting people to areas where they can actually get other therapy.
I can talk about the portable hyperbaric chambers or portable altitude chambers because I think that's quite a useful therapy in remote areas, and especially where you may not have well-developed rescue services. So the principle of a portable hyperbaric chamber is it's not like our diving chambers, which can really cause several atmospheres worth of pressure inside. It's an inflatable bag in which you put the person who's suffering from altitude illness, and then they typically are inflated using a foot pump, and that means that the supply of air going into the bag is dependent on somebody standing on that foot pump once every few seconds for the full duration that the bag is in use. And then the bag is pressurized on the inside to, depending on the particular model, but about an eighth of an atmosphere's pressure above the ambient pressure, the surrounding pressure of everyone who's outside. And what that does is it just raises the pressure that the patient is being exposed to and simulates them having come down often a few hundred meters. And in fact, because of the way that pressure decreases with increasing altitude, the higher you are when you put someone in a bag, the greater the simulated descent that they experience. So if you were to have somebody above 6,000 meters and put them in the bag, it would be the equivalent of bringing them down to about 4,000 meters. So a really, really big difference. And that can be used to reverse symptoms, to give other treatments a chance to set in and to work. And it can be used as a time bridge when you're in a situation where things need to be put in place in order to bring someone down, or perhaps because you're pinned down in a camp due to really, really severe weather. So they tend to be a fairly cost-effective treatment once you've got over the purchase price of a bag, which is probably comparable to buying an oxygen system. And the nice thing about them is that they don't run out of batteries, and as long as you've got people to keep on standing on the foot pump, then you can keep on treating casualties. It's not like there's a limited finite amount of compressed oxygen in a tank.
That was a perfect answer. I don't have anything to add.
Well, I know what Albie would have in his pocket. He would have a phone number for an insurance company that could get him out if he was in trouble. Right, Albie? That would be in your first aid kit.
That would be in my first aid kit, but I'm also a big stickler for the fact that you've got to have your own plan. So I think that does bring us to the point where we should be talking about travel insurance and about rescue modalities. So it's wonderful to have a telephone number for an insurance company in Brisbane in Australia in your pocket when you're on Kilimanjaro. But how are they going to get you off the mountain? Or how do they get you out of the Himalayas? Suman, maybe you want to talk a bit about that, about rescue in the Himalayas, what is possible, what's not possible, the good, the bad, and the ugly of rescue in the Himalayas.
Thank you, Alvi. So, rescue in the Himalayas, there is no organized system to get a rescue medical evacuation from the Himalayas. But nowadays there are lots of helicopter company, private company that does evacuate sick climbers, trekkers from the Himalayas. Few years back, we read in news about fraud medical evacuations. This has been addressed to some level, and the fake medical evacuations has gone down. But there are some events here and there. Other than that, we see lots of trekkers who are either underinsured or they don't know what their insurance is covering. Let's say a climber is climbing Everest and he gets sick at Camp 1, and his insurance might not be covering evacuations above base camp, that is Everest base camp. So you have to know in every details about your insurance, whether you have enough coverage when you are ill, if you are climbing, whether the coverage is above Everest base camp or not. And these are the things you need to be clear. And once you have a good insurance system in the Himalayas nowadays, if the weather permits, we don't have many night helicopters here to go in the nights, but if the daylight permits, there are many helicopter company that provides medical evacuations, which we can get from the Himalayas fairly quickly down to the Kathmandu, where the climbers, the patients can get good treatment.
I think there's a lot of limitations around that as well, and from personal experience, and not just from trekking. So I was doing a medical mission with Himalayan Healthcare near the West Bengal border, and we were with the National Geographic team actually, and we were heading back from one of the villages, and one of our nurses misstepped and fell about 20 feet down off a ledge and broke her arm. And luckily we were able to get down to her and kind of get her up, hoisted, and back to the village. very painfully, but we needed to fly her out to Kathmandu. She was in her 60s. She had a broken humerus or broken bone in her arm. And, you know, we spent 8 hours on the phone trying to get somebody to be able to fly in a helicopter to where we were to get her out to Kathmandu. There were a lot of variables that were an issue. Temperature, the weather changes were an issue. The time of day were an issue. Her credit card balance wasn't high enough. So the credit card company or the helicopter company wanted everything paid up front. So we needed to make sure that we had to get, you know, another credit card, everything paid up front before the helicopter would even come out, you know, to get her. So, you know, it's not as simple as just having that insurance number and being able to call. There's a lot of logistics that go around with it. And if you're there for a short amount of time, I mean, spending 8 hours on the phone, that meant 8 hours of me not seeing patients when I was up there for the purpose that I was up there for. So, you know, it's not that simple. And so I think that's the other aspect that people really need to understand is, you know, what are the risks when you are going remote, not even just for trekking, but for other places where you're going to be at altitude. What are the limits and challenges if something does happen, whether it's, you know, you get sick or whether you have an injury or whatnot. So knowing what are your emergency plans in those situations are good to know.
Yes, I totally agree. I'd like to add a point. Once I was with the trail running group in the Upper Mustang, that is in the Annapurna region. One of our trail runner got sick and got his high altitude cerebral edema. He has to be evacuated, and we found him sick early in the morning at around 6 or 7. He had an insurance. We were there, local people, to help him. We knew where to contact, but the problem is the Upper Mustang was a restricted zone, and you need to have a permission from home ministry to fly any helicopter there. It's not in the Everest region, it's a different region, but you have to have a permission from home ministry to fly a helicopter there in the Upper Mustang region, which is a restricted region due to its nearing because it borders Tibet, and that's a security concern in Nepal. So some of those unexpected things can come up while you await evacuations, and it took us around 4 or 5 hours to make everything happens. Ring at the home ministry and ring helicopter company, insurance company, and everything worked out at the end. But it took us so long for his patients while we are stranded up there.
Travelers from the global west are used to having care when they want it or need it, as the case may be. And that's not the reality in every country, and it is certainly not the reality when you go into the mountains in abroad. The reality is that it takes a lot of time to coordinate a rescue, and if you are fortunate enough to be one of the few places that have helicopters in the world to be able to perform that rescue, then you're able to do it if conditions allow for that dangerous rescue to be done with a helicopter. But in many parts of the world, you know, I did some training with some of the people who do search and rescue in the Andes and in Patagonia, and they spend literally days hiking in, packaging up the patient, and carrying them out for broken ankles. And so it's a 4-day rescue for a broken ankle. And that would be, you know, a 30-minute flight in a helicopter. And that's just the reality in many adventure travel destinations, is that we're going there for the wilderness, and you get the rescue considerations of the wilderness with it.
So I think, Madam Chair Lady, we've got a new podcast in the making, is talking about travel insurance and medevac and rescue. You know, you're talking helicopters, and it takes 4 days to carry a guy out, where it takes a helicopter 30 minutes. We recently medevaced a German geologist, for lack of a better word, from Kolwezi in the south of the DRC. Now, it's approximately a 3-hour jet air ambulance flight away, barring immigration and customs. it actually took 36 hours to get him to Joburg. And that's not carrying him out or no helicopter involved. It's all straight fixed wing air ambulance transport. But the paperwork, the logistics, dealing with insurance companies across time zones, dealing with insurance companies that reckoned they were going to fly the guy from Kinshasa to Nairobi when Kinshasa is 900 kilometers from the mine, and they don't know that. So the pitfalls of travel insurance and having to access it and actually use it are numerous. But back to Ross for what's your rescue plans for Kilimanjaro? How many helicopters around?
Yeah, Albie. So Achilles is another good example, and there was actually a rescue helicopter that was operating there for a while, but it was doubling as a tour operator and doing pleasure flips and doing transfers and all sorts of other things, and that's very, very typical for many areas of the world without very, very well established rescue services. That often the aircraft which is in the area and the aircraft which may come to evacuate you is entirely not medically equipped. It might be off on another tasking. It might not be available, and as Stephen alludes, the weather conditions might not be suitable. So I think for any situation, when we're talking about having a plan, that plan must involve what are we going to do if we don't have access to air support. And I think we've touched on many different subjects here, but one of the things which has come out without being mentioned explicitly is that we must have a clear idea of what the roles and the responsibilities are of people from the medical fraternity who are providing support on trips, whether they're doing that remotely as some kind of topside cover, whether they are a participant who is also a medic who is happy to help, or whether they're actually being asked to plan and provide a medical service, because those responsibilities actually rapidly increase when you are providing a really good service, and that is your responsibility. But even then, we need to think about, are we just providing a responsibility to the well-heeled tourist guests, or do we have a role and a responsibility to the locals, the porters, the climbers, the guides, etc. I wanted to ask at some point when we were sharing stories, I might have done the world's highest documented tooth extraction, because I pulled a septic tooth out of a porter at Kibo on Kilimanjaro at about 4,800 meters. So I'll lay down that gauntlet, gentlemen, and we can see if we can challenge. But I think my parting thought is, if people are interested in this kind of work, if they're wanting to be in this space, there are courses and training ranging from short courses to in situ training expeditions on some of these mountains to the full-blown diplomas like the diploma in mountain medicine, and really it's a great space to get more education. And that'll be my final point, is if this intrigues you, if it fascinates you as it does us, then come and join the fraternity and learn with us.
That's great, Ross. Fantastic way to end. Stephen, Suman, any last final thoughts or words before I wrap things up?
Thank you so much for having us, and I hope our discussion of high altitude illness hasn't scared people off of some fantastic adventures in the mountains. The message I hope people will take away is that they need to think carefully about their plan and to be able to have a safe trip, and that AMS is the body's way of telling you to stop going up.
Yes, I agree with Steve. Just remember that if you have symptoms, don't go up. If you have severe symptoms, go down. That's all I want to say.
I think the other message is as well, don't be embarrassed to let people know. I think often these treks are done in a group and people don't want to hold people back, and that's how people get in trouble. So you have to be honest, and as another member of the group, accepting of the fact that someone may not be coping physiologically with the climb at that pace, so you don't get everybody into trouble.
It should be a team, not just a group.
And that includes, a team collaborating with the locals as well, as Ross has mentioned, for sure, and taking care of each other. So thank you again to our guests, Stephen, Suman, and Ross, for joining us on this episode of Travel Unravelled. Whether you're a traveler chasing summits or a health provider guiding patients on high-altitude adventures, we hope this episode gave you some practical tools to recognize, prevent, and manage these potentially serious conditions. Remember, slow ascent, proper acclimatization, and knowing the early warning signs are really key to staying safe above the clouds. So thanks for joining us. We really hope today's discussion helped elevate your knowledge. And if you enjoyed this episode, share it with your fellow travelers and colleagues. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an update. As always, we've included all the links that we mentioned on today's episode in the podcast description, as well as some common profiles for different altitude elevations and some resources that can be used for travelers and travel providers. So until next time, stay safe, travel smart, and keep reaching for new heights. So that's a wrap for this episode. Thank you to our sponsor, the International Association for Medical Assistance to Travelers, located on the web at iamat.org. Don't forget to follow Travel Unravelled on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcast platform. We'll post fun clips and extra resources on the ISTM website located at learning.istm.org/podcast. We're also on Facebook, LinkedIn, X, and Instagram at _ISTM_. Finally, and thankfully, Travel Unravelled is produced by Ghost Bureau out of Toronto at ghostbureau.com.
Please remember that the information presented in this podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only. It should not be considered medical advice, nor is it intended to replace consultation with a qualified healthcare professional. The views expressed by the host and guests of this podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions or policies of the ISTM or any medical or other health professionals, hospitals, clinics, or healthcare facilities. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, the medical field is constantly evolving, and there may be new findings or developments not included in our content. We encourage our listeners to consult with their healthcare providers for any medical concerns or before starting any new treatment. Neither the ISTM nor any of its affiliates, sponsors, producers, hosts, or guests are liable for any direct, incidental, consequential, indirect, or punitive damages arising out of access to, use of, or inability to use the content of this podcast, or any errors or omissions in the content hereof. By listening to this podcast, you agree not to use this information as a substitute for, nor does it replace professional, medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always consult with your healthcare providers for guidance appropriate to your specific health situation. Thank you for listening to Travel Unravelled. We are committed to sharing knowledge and fostering discussion in the pursuit of better health and well-being.